The air in the library holds the weight of centuries, a delicate stillness that feels almost like a living thing. Dust drifts lazily through the warm shafts of late afternoon light, settling on the polished oak tables where parchment scrolls lie unfurled, their edges curled like sleeping petals. The faint scent of beeswax from the candles mixes with the papery aroma of vellum, a fragrance that feels older than memory. Outside, the muted sound of wind brushes against tall, leaded windows, a whisper that never quite enters but lingers at the edges. A lone scholar sits at the far table, his quill moving slowly, almost meditatively, across the page, each stroke a careful act of devotion. The soft rasp of ink on parchment seems to mark time itself, not in minutes, but in the steady rhythm of thought and craft. A stack of bound volumes rests beside him, their spines worn smooth from generations of touch. Somewhere deeper in the room, the faint clink of a book clasp closing carries like a bell in the quiet. As the sunlight shifts and takes on the mellow hue of evening, the shadows stretch long across the floor, weaving through the rows of towering shelves like silent rivers. It is in this hush, between the day's brightness and the coming night, that the library seems most alive, not in the bustle of voices, but in the slow breathing of a place built for keeping, remembering, and waiting. The scholar pauses, hands resting on the warm wood, and closes his eyes for a moment, as if to hear the echo of those who came before, their thoughts and dreams still murmuring from the parchment. The afternoon light spills gently across the reading desks, turning the pale parchment into sheets of quiet gold. The windows are tall and narrow, framed in dark stone, their glass rippling with imperfections that scatter the sun into soft patterns on the floor. Beneath them, shelves stand like sentinels, each carrying the weight of centuries in bindings of calfskin and oak boards. The air is warm, touched with the faint smell of lavender from sachets tucked discreetly between volumes to keep the moths at bay. A librarian moves along the aisles in a slow, unhurried rhythm, fingertips tracing the spines as if greeting old friends. Her robe whispers against the flagstones, a sound so soft it becomes part of the silence rather than breaking it. On one table, an open manuscript lies under a pane of polished glass, its ink still deep black despite the passing of hundreds of years. The edges of the vellum are smooth yet uneven, revealing the hand of the craftsman who once shaped it. A small sand timer stands beside it, grain slipping through its neck with measured grace, marking neither urgency nor haste, only the steady unfolding of time. The faint flutter of pages turning comes from another corner, a monk in plain woolen robes, absorbed in a volume of herbals, his lips moving silently as he reads. The outside world is distant here, muffled by thick walls and the embrace of history. This is not a place for quick glances or hurried searches. It is a place for lingering, for letting the hours stretch and dissolve until one's mind moves at the same pace as the turning of the page. The light has mellowed into the soft warmth of late afternoon, filtering through latticed windows and laying gentle patterns over the long refectory table in the center of the parchment room. Along its length lie rolls of scrolls tied with silk ribbons, their knots loose as though they have been waiting centuries to be untied. The faint creak of leather bindings accompanies the measured steps of a young apprentice who carries a tray bearing a small inkwell and a bundle of quills newly trimmed to sharp points. He places them beside an elder scribe whose hands are ink-stained yet steady, his every motion deliberate and without wasted energy. The scribe leans over a fresh sheet of calfskin, smoothing it with the flat of his palm before beginning a careful line of script. The air is tinged with the scent of warm parchment and the faint smoke from a single beeswax candle, its flame swaying as if in response to the scribe's breathing. In the far alcove, a brass clock ticks quietly, not to count down the hours, but to remind those present of the slow, even passing of time. Shadows gather in the corners, and the gold on the edges of illuminated pages catches the last light, glimmering like embers in a fading hearth. As the apprentice settles onto the bench beside the elder, their heads bent in mutual silence, it feels as if the very act of writing is a prayer,
one that asks for nothing but the preservation of thought in the most patient way imaginable. Within the hushed walls, the sound of a quill scratching faintly against vellum is like the distant murmur of rain. Afternoon light pools on the polished surface of the desk, revealing faint grooves worn into the wood from years of repeated use. Beside the scribe's hand rests a small ceramic cup of herbal infusion, steam curling into the still air. The tea's fragrance, a mix of chamomile and dried orange peel, mingles with the subtle musk of ancient bindings. Across the room, a spiral staircase curls upward to a narrow gallery lined with books so high they seem to touch the carved beams overhead. The banister is smooth from generations of hands, its surface darkened to a warm sheen. A shaft of light illuminates the motes of dust that dance slowly in the air, drifting as if they too have learned the art of lingering. Near the hearth, long unlit but still carrying the faint scent of ash, sits an archivist carefully repairing a torn page with wafer-thin strips of parchment and a brush dipped in paste. Each movement is unhurried, the page smoothed again and again until the seam is invisible. The heavy door at the far end of the room remains closed, holding the quiet in place like a precious thing. Outside, faint bells from a distant church chime the hour, their sound softened by the thickness of the stone walls. Within, no one stirs quickly. Each motion is part of a centuries-old rhythm where thought, hand, and page move together in perfect stillness.
The light from the high, arched windows falls in narrow ribbons, casting pale gold across the floor of cool, worn flagstone. Along the far wall, shelves rise in orderly ranks, their heavy wooden frames holding manuscripts bound in leather the color of deep earth and faded wine. The air is warm and dry, carrying the faint sweetness of parchment and the sharper note of ink freshly mixed in a small brass pot. A pair of scholars sits at a narrow table, each surrounded by small towers of books, their spines cracked with age. Between them, an open atlas reveals seas rendered in faded blues, islands drawn like jewels in the margins. The elder of the two pauses in his work, tilting his head as though listening to a voice carried through the years from the page. Beyond the shelves, a low archway leads to a hidden alcove where a single candle burns, illuminating a desk scattered with loose folios and a magnifying glass with a handle of polished walnut. The pages here are finer, their surfaces smooth as river stones, the ink so dark it almost shimmers in the light. Somewhere above, a pigeon settles into the eaves, its feathers rustling softly. The scholars exchange no words, yet their silence feels companionable, like two travelers resting beside the same road. The afternoon presses gently onward, but in the parchment room, time itself seems to move at the turning of the page. The parchment room rests in a quiet wing of the library, where even the air seems to hold its breath. Afternoon light streams in through tall windows latticed with slender lead, painting the floor in shifting shapes as clouds drift lazily overhead. The scent of the room is layered, beeswax from polished shelves, the faint tang of iron gall ink, the earthy warmth of calfskin parchment stacked neatly in wooden drawers. A clerk in a dark woolen tunic leans over a wide desk, carefully measuring margins with a bone ruler before making the first mark of ink. Each stroke is slow, deliberate, and curved like the stem of a plant, the script blooming across the page in patient elegance. Against the far wall, a large globe stands on its carved base, its seas a pale green, and its continents drawn in delicate lines that speak of an older understanding of the world. A small ladder leans against the highest shelf, its rungs worn smooth where countless feet have climbed to reach the topmost volumes. Outside the walls, the day hums quietly, but here, within this room, all motion is subdued, every gesture purposeful. The light deepens, turning the pages to the warm hue of honey, and the clerk pauses, his fingers resting lightly on the parchment. For a moment it feels as if the words themselves are listening,
waiting for the next line to carry them forward into history.
Late in the afternoon, the light in the parchment room turns to a soft amber, brushing the high rafters and lending the entire space the warmth of a long-held memory. The long tables are scattered with scrolls tied in faded ribbons, their ends frayed like the hems of much-worn garments. At one end of the room, a librarian sits with a small pile of manuscripts, each bound in a leather too fragile to be opened without care. She wears thin gloves of kid leather, her fingers turning the pages as though they were petals that might crumble at a breath. In the stillness, the only sound is the whisper of parchment against parchment, an almost imperceptible rustle that carries like a lullaby. On the windowsill, a clay pot of rosemary leans toward the sun, its fragrance mingling with the dry sweetness of the room. Beyond the walls, the muffled murmur of the city drifts upward, the clop of hooves on cobblestones, the distant call of a vendor. But here they arrive softened, as though filtered through the weight of time. The librarian pauses, looking toward the window where dust motes drift like tiny lanterns in the late light. For a moment, the scene seems suspended, as though the whole room is listening to its own quiet heartbeat, steady and unchanged for centuries. The air feels as though it might hold this hour forever, keeping it safe within the bindings of its books.